Involvement with the criminal justice system is life-changing. It matters.
Having a justice system that works is a really important part of a democratic society.
I'm Penelope Gibbs, Director of Transform Justice.
I'm Rob Allen. I've worked in and around criminal justice all my career.
This is the Transform Justice podcast, throwing light on the criminal justice system.
Hearing from people who know.
It's about whether the system's fair
and what can be done to make it better.
Today we're discussing a scourge of our time, knife crime. Recorded knife crime has increased by over 80% in the last decade and shows no sign of abating. Joining me are Rob Allen, my co-presenter, Jon Yates, Chief Executive of the Youth Endowment Fund, and Craig Pinkney, criminologist and urban youth specialist. We recorded this episode in May, before any election had been announced. Rob, there is a lot of concern about knife crime at the moment. Is this new?
Well, sadly, it's not new. It's one of those issues that gets to the top of the political agenda every few years, it seems. There was a lot of concern about 15 years ago, I remember. Media campaigns, calls for tougher enforcement. Whether it worked or not, I don't know, but it certainly seems to be back at the top of the agenda at the moment.
Jon, when people hear the word knife crime, I think that they assume that it involves people, usually boys, actually using a knife to threaten or stab. Is that what most knife crime is about?
No, it's not. Actually, the numbers can sometimes mislead us a bit. When people talk about knife crime, meaning crimes involving a knife, the most common crime is someone carrying a knife. And so we have situations where we hear tens of thousands of knife crime incidents have occurred. And the reasonable person thinks, oh, that means tens of thousands of people have attacked someone with a knife. It's not what's happened. It means that they've been found carrying a knife. The other thing that I think we're just going to be really careful about is whether crimes involving knives are getting worse. People will say knife crime's gone up by 80%. It's really hard to be clear that's actually true. So we know that the police, for example, record how often they find someone carrying a knife or using a knife. Those numbers have gone up. But when you look at the number of people turning up in hospital, having been injured with a knife, or the number of people who've lost their lives to a knife, they don't show anything like that sort of increase. And so I'm always sort of keen to say two things. One, this is a really serious topic. There's nothing more important to talk about than people fearing for their lives. Let's take it seriously. And secondly, let's not terrify people by suggesting this is everywhere, rising rapidly, because one of the reasons that people carry a knife at all is because they think everyone else is and because they're very afraid. And so I think we've got to try and get all of this quite carefully in perspective, especially when we're talking to younger people and to vulnerable people.
Yeah, that's an interesting caveat about the figures. Craig, why do you think boys and young men do carry them?
I concur with a lot of the stuff that Jon said. And I want to just throw in there that when we're also talking about knife crime, we also don't often reflect on things like domestic violence. We don't often talk about hooliganism or the interpersonal conflicts that people have where they utilize a sharp object. So when we talk about this issue around knife crime, what you tend to find is two things that tend to happen. One, it's very gendered, where the focus is predominantly young males. Secondly, it's also racialized. So this kind of scaremongering around it's an epidemic would make onlookers within the society believe that it's only taking place in one particular area. We work in a lot of rural and affluent areas, for example, and what you tend to find is there's a lot of young people that are petrified, scared, because they believe, like Jon said, that other people are carrying knives, and that then becomes part of the culture.
Are you saying that the carrying of knives is mainly about people fearing for their own safety? And therefore they think that if they carry the knife, they'll be safer?
I think the motivation is multifaceted then, and it's also nuanced. There tends to be three categories that I tend to find. So you've got the young person that carries a knife because his mate carries a knife. Zombie knives, Rambo knives are constantly on social media and everybody's posting a picture with these knives. So it's a little bit of bravado. And then you've got the other category of young people that carry a knife because something's happened in their environment, whether that be at school, whether that be en route to school, in their local community, and something's happened that's triggered the thought to think that to keep myself safe, I need to arm myself. And then the third category of individuals are individuals that may be involved in form of organized criminality, groups that may be involved in street gangs. Also, mental health plays a really interesting part in this conversation. That's why I say it's multifaceted.
If, John, the numbers have gone up of young people carrying knives, and it's a big if, why do you think that is?
I don't think they are going up. Police recorded data is generally pretty unreliable because police do change their methods of recording data. So I think the most reliable data is how many murders have occurred, because you have a body. It's very hard for that data to be inaccurate. And the number of 16 to 24-year-olds who've been murdered in the last year has gone down by 19%, since pre-COVID down 30%. Over 10 years, it's up about 14%. It goes up and down. And I think what happens is the media tends to be very, very keen to tell us when the numbers are going up and not so keen to talk about it when the numbers go down. And so it slightly gives us a sense that it's always getting worse. I think the thing I would say is, why is there violence at all? We surveyed about 7,000 children recently, and half of them said they changed their behaviour because of the fear of violence. So what's driving the incidents that are occurring? And I think there's probably two things to get at here. The first is, why on earth would someone carry a knife in the first place? And we talked about fear, but we also talked a bit about status. And I think listeners might say, well, why would you carry a knife for status? The truth is, humans do all sorts of weird things for status. You know, my 2-year-old used to put rubber bands around her scooter because it was the thing that everyone did. We're desperate to be recognised. And the worst thing that can happen to a human being is feel that they don't matter. And a lot of children grow up, unfortunately, without any adults around them who are able to reliably reassure them that they matter. And that's partly about what's happening in their parents' lives. It's partly about the society around them. And those children find a way to say, I really matter, and it's picking up a knife.
And my add-on is also to consider the political and economic shifts too. Let's go back to 2008 and 2009, provisions, initiatives that were directly supporting children and young people. And then we went into a conservative government, and then we started seeing a lot of cuts within youth and community spaces within the police. So when we talk about this kind of nature of motivation, it's not just about pointing a finger at children and young people and saying, why are they carrying knives, without reflecting on what's happened politically in our country, what's been removed, what's been taken away, what's exacerbated these issues. And I remember in 2011, I was working at a local youth centre within the West Midlands. And I remember saying that if we start to cut back services, we're going to start to see an increase in issues within our local communities. And then as we see the increase in county lines and exploitation of all forms, and that's where the issue and the concern is.
Craig, thinking about the fear issue, the boys that you know and the young men, do they fear the police, stop and search, etc.? Presumably not nearly as much as their peers, otherwise they wouldn't carry the knife.
It's a bit of both. I don't find that all young people are essentially the same. I know young people that don't want to go to prison. I know young people that don't want to end up in a police station. I know young people that don't want to go to a pupil referral unit or alternative provision outside of mainstream education. I know a whole host of young people that will say they don't want to end up in those places, but they've got needs that need to be met. If I was to put myself in the shoes of a 13-year-old, there's probably a couple of things that would go around in my head. And one of them might be thinking, well, if I'm living in an environment where people may be hostile for a whole bunch of reasons, if I've got a friendship group that live on my street, in my cul-de-sac, on my estate, if I walk with a group of these individuals on the way to school, is that potentially going to reduce my probability of being targeted or me being vulnerable? Well, yes. If I was to carry a weapon, would that, in my mind, reduce the issue of me potentially being targeted or being vulnerable? Yes. So when you actually start to make sense of what these young people are essentially saying, and you go back to that question around, is it about fear that's greater than consequence? It's not clean cut. So you've got this binary where these children and young people are saying, well, I don't want to get into trouble, but how am I going to ensure that I'm okay if there's been a reduction in services, a reduction in the things that's supposed to focus on how young people are supposed to navigate?
And if I could add to what Craig's saying, I think two things that are really significant here. One is the council has a budget called Children's Services, which is there to support families as they're really struggling. The number of children being turned away from that need has been going up. And so there's the broader support that isn't always there. The second bit, we haven't talked about social media. So a child might say to their mate, "Oh, I can't believe they've done that. I'm going to get them. I'm going to do something about it." And when I was a kid, you might say something like that and you can deny it. If it's written down on social media, you can't deny it. It's very easy for someone to say something back, and things escalate. And I think we need to sort of worry about the sort of turbocharging of children feeling like they're being slighted, that they're being put down. As I say, lots of children deal with that fine. They have a parent, they have someone who advises them how to handle it. A lot of our children don't have that. And if they're also carrying a weapon, these things can move into something quite nasty. We see in our surveys 2/3 of violence that children tell us about, they say it's because they felt provoked. That can make it sound all very flippant. It's not. It's the constant lack of social support to a child that means in the moment they respond to being provoked violently rather than feeling it's not the end of the world, someone doesn't like me, I'll just move on.
I mean, John, over the last 20 years or so, quite a lot of money has been spent by government and local authorities and the police on trying to reduce knife crime. Have any of those targeted initiatives made a difference? What have you found?
Yeah, so some things really do work. The first thing is let's get the support to the right children. Most of us are sort of moving around trying to help the same children, but not always doing it in a joined up way. So what do I mean same? Children who are severely absent from school, missing, say, 50% of lessons. That's the S. A, children who have been arrested. M, children who have gone missing. Children who have been excluded from school. So whenever we get targeted support to those children, you've got much more of a chance of making a difference. The second is what sort of support? What does work? Well, three little things. The first one, mentoring. Great mentoring makes a real difference. One of my colleagues, Kieran, was a mentor to someone who I think is a phenomenal youth worker now, a guy called Jamar. And Jamar very openly tells a story of having been mentored for 5 years. And then tragically, Jamar's brother was murdered. And the first person Jamar called was Kieran. And the question Jamar asked Kieran is, what do I do? And Kieran said, you just need to mourn and you just need to be with your friends, be with your family and wait and do nothing. And Jamar says that conversation transformed his life. But it was 5 years of building a relationship that meant in the moment, Kieran was there. Mentoring makes a colossal difference to young people, but we need to invest in it. The second is therapy. And people will say, that sounds very soft. And I'm always like, I don't really care whether we're tough or soft. I'd just like to be smart. Let's do the stuff that actually helps. And there's a brilliant program that's come across actually from Chicago called Becoming a Man. And what it does is it identifies young people, about 13, 14. They meet once a week, and they've got a circle, a group of trust, where they share their stories from the week. And the really highly trained leader of that group isn't just advising and mentoring them, he's helping them to give a name to their feelings and to think about a different way they might handle it. And it's been proved to make a colossal difference. And the third and final thing, which is less popular for those who love some of those early stuff, is what's called hotspots policing, which is about trying to make sure police are visibly present and known in areas where bad things tend to happen to children. And those are normally not at all residential places. They tend to be places where everyone comes off the bus at the same time after school. And violence is often in the spur of the moment. And that sense of, hang on, there might be someone here. I'm just going to leave it today. May mean tomorrow it never happens. But the police don't often like to do that sort of just being regularly for 15 minutes in the same place because it can find it a bit dull. So there are things that can really save lives. We just need to persistently, dully fund them, invest in them and do them.
And just to add on to that, it's definitely about long term. We've developed this April to March the 31st mindset where we kind of throw money at things and hope for the best over the 12 months. And then if it doesn't work, we ditch it, find new money, and then replace it with something else. And I think when we talk about things like youth work, it's been proven that youth work works over a sustained, consistent period of time. And what that requires is individuals that have an evidence base to go out and do the work, and they're able to kind of look at young people in their uniqueness, and be able to think of ways to engage? Is it just now that we go to an assembly and just talk to kids for 45 minutes? Or is it a little bit more? Because the times have changed. And then it's about how do we get communities to be involved in these particular issues? And then the third thing is, well, what are the messages to children and young people around masculinity, misogyny, healthy relationships, mental health, well-being, substance misuse, and not just focusing on clearly the issue and the moral panic around knife crime. So when we do work and support organizations that do work, we look at the things that really are at the root of the issues: trauma, relationship building, self-esteem, and fear, as we mentioned earlier on, guilt, hurt, shame, ego, respect. And what do those things mean in terms of the character and the makeup of a human being? Because I argue that these are the things that are most important, as opposed to just traditionally going back to tell a bunch of kids, don't pick up a knife or you're going to go to jail, get the police in, tell them how long they're going to get if they get caught with a knife. And that's about it. We need to be up to the time, but it requires that all of us come together and start thinking a little bit innovatively around this work.
Yeah. And I think it requires us to be really serious minded about what actually works and what doesn't. We don't presently have any proper testing of people going in and doing these assemblies. So there's no evidence that that approach actually makes a difference. I'm not saying people aren't trying to do good, but we know that certain other things really do work.
Surely one of the problems, John, is that going into a school and doing an assembly is a relatively cheap program, but people have spent millions on programs like knife education programs and media campaigns and this kind of thing, and they have put their heart and soul into them and are quite attached to them. Surely there is a bit of a problem unattaching people just because they've invested so much in it already.
100%. And the Youth Endowment Fund that I lead, this mission is to find out what works to change the lives of vulnerable children and then to pass that on. And I say a lot to colleagues, if everyone loves us, we've failed. Because if I say that the thing you've put your heart and soul into, great moral person, doesn't work, it's kind of weird if you don't at some point dislike me. Some things don't work. Oh, there's no evidence they work. Media campaigns, there's no evidence that makes a difference. Why does it happen? It's quite easy for the government to do it. You just pull a lever and you put some adverts out. Knife surrender programs, there's no evidence that makes a difference.
Well, just explain what they are.
So it's a sort of bin might be set up locally with a small hole in it where someone could surrender a knife. But there's no evidence that they work. And I think it's quite likely that they probably don't work. And the reason I say that is there's a lot of knives in our country. If you go into my kitchen, you can find 3 or 4 knives you could use to really injure somebody. And so it's quite unlikely we're going to get rid of all of the knives for children to get hold of. The second thing is when you look in the US, you get something where the government's tried to buy guns off people. Those programs have been evaluated. They're called gun buyback schemes, and they've been found to make no difference. The other one here is knife awareness programs, and Craig alluded to it. Explaining to a child that carrying a knife isn't a very good idea, understanding why they might carry it, and trying to tell them about the law. Most children know these things, and therefore it's unlikely it's going to make much of a difference. But again, it hasn't been actually evaluated, so it's one thing we're trying to do. But it should worry us that the majority of children who get arrested carrying a knife either seem to get no support or might well get put on a knife awareness program. And we should really try and change that so they're more likely to get some sort of mentoring support, some sort of therapy support.
Craig, have you got frustrated at seeing money kind of wasted on things that, you thought weren't going to work and haven't worked?
Yeah, very much so. And I think for me, it's about what else needs to be brought to the table. So one of the things we talk a lot about within our work is, getting organizations to think about their approach. Does that approach include parents, individuals within a local community? What is the type of messaging that's going to young people? Is it about knife crime? Is it about violence? Or is it about something else? Is it about getting them to think about themselves in a context outside of the world that they're in? Perfect example, we just done a project where we got young people to come to our local university. I'm talking about 7 minutes away from where they live. There's the university. Young people believed that they couldn't make it there. And then to take young people into that institution and show them professionals, professors and doctors that look like them, that taught like them. So what we're doing is we're also showing young people There is opportunities outside of your circumference. And you know what? We're not just going to talk about violence. We're not just going to talk about relationships. We're also going to talk about your future.
That's really interesting. I mean, there's been lots of evidence over the years that these scared straight programs, taking young people into prison to try and frighten them, just don't work. But they've got such a common sense appeal. I mean, taking people to universities sounds like much better.
And they've not just got like a common sense appeal. A lot of these programs that don't work move our heartstrings, actually. Like the story of Railway Prison in New Jersey, which came up with the idea. It was, it's a group of prisoners who said, we want to give something back. And the governor said, yeah, let's not waste your life. Let's give a chance for you to tell young people the mistakes you made so they don't make the same mistakes. And they opened the prison up. They told these stories. Someone made a movie about it. It won a documentary Oscar. They interviewed the children and they said, this has been transformational. It's changed the way I think. And so politicians expanded it right across the US. But it wasn't until someone did some proper research to see, does this program actually help or hurt children, that they found the program was incredibly effective. It made children 25% more likely to commit acts of crime in one study. I mean, that's awful. Like taxpayers' money was being used to damage the lives of children. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like it was an amazing, heroic thing. And I think we've just got to keep that in our memory, that it can feel good, it can sound good, and us adults can love it, but it might not be good for children.
Jon, one of the things that you have found that works, which surprised me a little bit, I must say, are schemes in which youth workers go into hospitals and work with young people who have either been injured or they are friends of people that have been injured. Can you tell us a little bit about that? It's not something I've really come across before.
Yeah, so what we'd say on something like A&E Navigators is it's really promising, but some more evaluations and tests need to be done. So we're funding a couple at the moment. Children who are seriously injured and attacked will end up often in hospital. And so the thought was, well, can we put people to mentor children actually within the context of the hospital? So the child who's recovering has the opportunity to turn to someone to say, yeah, I would like some advice, I'd like some help, I'd like to build a relationship.
But are there many of these schemes up and down the country, or are they relatively few and far between?
Yeah, they've really grown. I can think of programs in most major cities, actually, in England and Wales. But we do need a little bit more testing, because there are some things that are quite tough about a program like this. So if I give an example, you need to make sure that the person doing the relationship building has won the trust of the hospital. That can be quite hard. They then need to be able to build a relationship with the child. It's a pretty difficult context to do that in. And then they may have to pass that relation on to someone else who's not based in the hospital. That's again not entirely easy to do. So I think we should not get too sort of carried away until we've got a little bit more evidence.
I was going to add on to that. One of the things that I find should be more of a discussion is about how do we integrate these amazing initiatives within community. So a child wakes up in a trauma unit, they open their eyes, they meet a youth worker that they've never seen before, never heard of them. What you oftentimes find is that if it's a young person, they're most likely known to some sort of youth provision, they're most likely known to a school, they're most likely known to an agency of some sort. So there needs to be more joint up multi-agency working. So when that child opens their eyes, they're like, you know what, I might not know Jon directly, but Jon represents an organization that I also know is president in the community.
I completely agree with that. And if we just sort of start from the point of view that children who are carrying weapons to defend themselves don't have high levels of trust for other people they don't know, often for quite good reasons, for things that have happened to them when they were younger. And they also long to belong to something. They long to find a place where they feel safe. And so I think the idea that we just come up with a clever, proven intervention idea, some sort of support, and just drop it from the sky is ideally something to avoid. Like, it's much better to think, where are the places that children already feel like they might have a connection? And so how do we make our schools the sort of places where children might feel really safe? And school is often seen as a very safe place to lots of children, not all, but lots. How do we make sure there are mentors there? How do we make sure there's access to therapy there? If a child is arrested, and lots of children who are arrested might get passed to what's called the youth offending team, and they'd have a worker who is allocated to them, those relationships can often be very positive. Actually, how do we make sure that there's really good support at that point, and we're investing in that institution? How do we reform the systems that children rely on? because they often have the relationships, but they need to be able to serve the needs of children by doing what really works.
Talking about ideas which may be parachuted into every area, in the Labour Party's kind of policy ideas, there's this idea which is very focused on knife crime of youth hubs, which sounds as if it's bringing local services together to deliver support for the teenagers in that area. Craig, what do you think about youth hubs?
I think my position has changed. I feel like there's so much that has happened. I feel like as a society, I don't think that we've dealt with the recession. I don't feel like we've dealt with the ripple effect of what that created. I don't think that we've come to grips with what all of the data suggests about young people around vulnerability, their mental health, their well-being, the increase of suicide and self-harm and substance misuse, and the ripple effect of COVID. So part of me is going to say, yes, we do need to have buildings, we need to have resources for young people to be engaged. But my thinking now is about what type of services are we going to be able to provide for those young people? Because if it is about just opening buildings to just warehouse children and young people, I don't think that that is the way that we need to go forward. It is about some of the things that Jon and I have been talking about, focusing on the mental health, focusing on the trauma, looking at that fear, offering opportunities, whether it's around jobs or training and so on and so forth.
I mean, Jon, there's not a lot of detail about what these youth hubs are actually going to be in practice. But, I mean, is there a good evidence base for that kind of approach, do you think?
I think Labour's policy on youth hubs has got two elements to it. One I have more sort of energy about than the other. So one of them is the idea of creating some sort of hub, as you say, and it's really unclear exactly what that means. I do worry that we think we get into, let's just build some buildings. We don't lack for buildings. We actually have tons of buildings. We have 25,000 buildings called schools that actually don't have that much going on often in the evening. We do not need more buildings. What we need is really brilliant youth workers who can build relationships with children. So I sort of wait to see a bit on the hub part of it, therefore. There's another bit, though, which they talk about a targeted programme of support for children. I'm really interested in that. There are children who have desperate needs from feeling very unsafe, from threats that come at them day by day, and they might well turn to the local authority for help. And at the moment, unfortunately, what happens is the answer is often, well, you've reached the Children's Services Department, we're here to support children, but we're here to support you if the safety issue comes from within your family. Well, often it doesn't. So the idea of actually providing proper support to children who are unsafe from a risk outside of their family, which is what we're talking about here, and actually then being able to make sure we've got great mentors, great supporters, great therapists coming in for those children, hence targeted. I like that idea a lot. I think that's potentially really promising. We've got to do it carefully and thoughtfully and well, But I think there's a lot of merit in that idea if it's done well.
Craig, also in that Labour policy is a lot about very, very tough police enforcement. And I have to say that that whole issue of the criminal justice system is one we haven't really got to yet. But we now have a system where there's a mandatory prison sentence for children of 16 and 17 who've been caught twice with a knife. Does that work?
I think as a parent, as a member of the community, as somebody that works with children and young people, our main priority is that we want our children, our young people, and our communities to be safe. So any intervention that's rolled out with the belief that it is going to reduce, it's going to protect, it's going to serve communities, I'm all up for it. The problem I have is injustice. The problem I have is bias. The problem I have is targeted interventions that only seem to target particular groups and people. So let's just talk about, for example, stop and search. Many individuals from local communities are not opposed to stop and search. What they're opposing is the imbalance in power that's oftentimes utilized in order to target particular groups of individuals. And two, punishment around this particular issue, it serves a purpose. It gets rid of individuals and groups of people that may be a cause of concern for a period of time, but what it doesn't do is get rid of the problem. And I think the conversations that Jon and I have been trying to, make sense of, that is not one shoe that fits all in this particular scenario, and I can say this from working with young people that have been in street gangs where there's been a criminal justice intervention such as moving someone out of area, has proven to work. But that doesn't mean that all young people need to have the same consequence. And I think what we need to be thinking about is more of a tailored approach.
Jon, is this something that your organisation has looked at? Sanctions, enforcement, prisons, what sort of impact they have on this?
Yeah, so there's been a real move over the last decade for children who are arrested not to be taken to court, and instead for some form of support to be put in place. And generally, the evidence is that that results in less violence and crime in the long run. For most children who commit some sort of offence, a short stay in prison is not going to help at all. It's quite likely to make things worse. And actually, some sort of support is probably the way to go. To be honest, the thing that worries me most at the moment is the children who are arrested carrying a knife and not being given any support, because the guidance that's given to police when they arrest a child for carrying a knife is that they should be passed over to the youth offending team and they should be given mandatory support. But when I talk to youth justice workers, they're often saying to me slightly quietly, often children are getting nothing. But you won't get from me a sense that prison is always the wrong idea, that prison is always to be avoided. For people who've committed very serious acts like murder, a longer period in prison actually is often the right thing, not least that obviously the community are safer during the period when the person is in prison. But it is worth just being frank and saying people do grow out of violence and crime. But I think we were right, absolutely right by the evidence, to significantly reduce the number of children who are going to prison.
Okay, I think that's a good note to finish on. We end these episodes by asking each of you in turn if there was one thing you could do to try and reduce, in this case, knife crime, what would it be? Craig, what would be the one thing if you were Home Secretary?
I would enforce a real, rigorous public health approach to dealing with this particular issue. A approach which really cements itself within the fibre of our society, that really looks at these issues holistically and not just from a criminal justice lens, that when somebody does something wrong, we just lock them up and throw away the key.
Okay. Jon, what about you?
So I'm going to be the education secretary for my solution. I would take the chunk of money that's going to become available because pupil numbers are falling, and I would give that money out to schools on the basis of the number of children they have who have a social worker. And I'd ring fence that money for those schools to use to get wider system support for those children. We know who these children are. We know where they are. We know what they need. Let's change things.
Rob, you're Home Secretary. What are you going to do?
Well, I don't think this is very dramatic, but I was struck by what I think both of our guests said about the need for a long-term approach to this. So almost whatever, if there's some evidence that something works, let's do it. Let's try and do it everywhere, and let's do it for a decent length of time and not change every 2 or 3 years and have to come up with a new name. We've got the beginnings of an evidence base. Let's invest in it.
Great. Good ideas. Thanks, Rob, Craig and Jon. And all the information about our guests and the subject is in our programme notes. If you've appreciated this podcast, do subscribe. That way you'll be alerted when we release a new one. Thanks. Bye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.